Because I'm not sure I could read. That's what.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Paul Atwood. I'm the interim director of the William Joyner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences. And I invited Michael today, and we've invited him on a number of occasions in the past. We're happy to welcome him again. I think many of you are probably familiar with his work. Those of you who are not are going to get a very good glimpse into it this afternoon. Before I formally introduce him, I just want to say that I hope, and I'm sure he will answer this question. We hear of peak oil, but what of peak coal, peak gas, and peak uranium, peak copper, and probably the most precious resource of all, namely water. And what does the depletion of vital materials mean for entire populations? What does all this mean for future armed conflict in a world already racked with bloodshed? So, I'm pleased to introduce Michael. He is Five College Professor of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College, defense correspondent for The Nation magazine, author of many books, including Resource Wars and Blood and Oil, The Dangers and Consequences of America's Growing Petroleum Dependence. He also teaches at Amherst College, Smith College, Holyoke College, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, on the boards of directors of Human Rights Watch, Arms Control Association, Computers for the Nation, and Mother Jones, and many other such publications. He was also the narrator for a very good film that I highly recommend, Blood and Oil, which was produced by the Education Foundation, and which I find essential to my own classes here at the
So everybody make themselves comfortable. I'm going to be comfortable, if that's okay with you. And I'm very happy to be here, and I'm grateful for the Joyner Center to bring me here. Happy to have this chance to talk with you all. This talk is based on my new book called The Race for What's Left. The subtitle is The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. And I have a few copies if anybody's interested in buying one. So, can you all hear me? So, because I don't have the microphone, but I'll speak loud. Everybody hear me okay? Good. If you have trouble, raise your hand or something. So when I started writing this book about 3 years ago, I mainly pictured it as a saga of environmental invasion and destruction, a report on the corporate assault on the world's last resource preserves. In particular, I aim to show how the giant extractive industries, what they're called, the mining companies and the energy companies and the timber companies, how they are being driven by the depletion of existing resource supplies to conduct an assault on the world's last resource preserves. Places like the Arctic region, Greenland, Siberia, the deep oceans, inner Amazon, inner Africa, and a few places that have escaped exploitation up until now for a variety of reasons, like Mongolia, Afghanistan because of fighting, Iran, Iraq for all kinds of political reasons. These are the world's last resource preserves. And if you read my book, you will indeed find multiple examples of the assault that is now taking place around the world on these last resource preserves. This summer, we saw the most intense assault on the Arctic, for example. Royal Dutch Shell made an all-out attempt to begin drilling in the Beaufort and the Chukchi Sea off of Alaska. Drilling began in and around Greenland, in Siberia, and so on. Also, mineral extraction began in many of those parts of the world. And mining is beginning on a very large scale in Mongolia and Afghanistan for the first time. So the kind of assault that I've described on these last resource preserves is indeed well underway. And as I would have expected, this assault has terrifying consequences for the ecology, for the environment of these places, and for the peoples who inhabit them. Many of these areas, by very definition, are remote, inhospitable areas that contain the world's last indigenous tribes that still practice their traditional ways of life. The Inuit peoples of Greenland and Nunavut, the part of Canada that's occupied by the native peoples in the northern parts of Canada, the people of Lapland, the northern part of Scandinavia and Siberia, and the people who inhabit inner Amazon in Africa, and so on. These are the last hunter-gatherers who still practice a traditional way of life. All these people face the utter destruction of their traditional culture as a result of mining and drilling activities taking place in these remote areas. These are also areas which are, again, because of their location, where there are many endangered species, where many species which are living at the edge of existence anyway, in the Arctic in particular, in Greenland, which are already facing the threat of extinction, and where drilling activities, mining activities are putting many of these species at risk. So indeed, this kind of environmental destruction and habitat destruction that I expected to find, I found on a very large scale as I did my research. And if you're interested to see what's happening to our planet as these last wilderness areas come under assault, you need to read my book. And as I expected, this is also associated with corporate greed, because many of these companies are making immense amounts of money by exploiting these mineral and energy resources. But the more I studied these phenomena, the more I saw a different, or a grander, if you want, a grander process at work. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. What I came to see all this is as a grand Darwinian struggle that's taking place in front of our eyes. A struggle for control over what remains of the planet's original natural resource bounty, with profound consequences for survival of the planet, human species, and indeed all species on the planet. Let me talk about that. That's what I want to talk with you about today. At the first level of approximation, this Darwinian struggle is a struggle among the most powerful corporations that humans have created. The giant energy companies like ExxonMobil and Shell, Royal Dutch Shell and Chevron, and their Russian and Chinese state-owned equivalents, Total of France, BP, and so on, and the mining equivalents. These companies face a powerful dilemma. All of the resource supplies that they have relied on for their growth and their wealth over the past century are now depleted for the most part. Read the reports, read the annual reports of Exxon and Chevron and BP and Shell, and you will find that they are getting diminishing returns from their traditional sources of energy. All of them, therefore, must compete with one another for the remaining sources of supply in these few areas that are left, like the Arctic, Russia, Iran, Iraq, wherever they manage to be able to go. And there's clearly not enough to keep all of these companies in business. And the same is true for whether you're in the mineral business, iron and copper, or specialty minerals like rare earths and coltan, and so on. All of the existing supplies are diminishing rapidly, and so all of these companies, to survive, must plunder what's left on the planet. So these companies are increasingly engaged in a life and death struggle amongst themselves to survive by grabbing control over these remaining reserves, or grasping control of each other to get hold of resources. An example of this that I write about is BP. BP, you'll recall, was the company responsible for the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. When BP, when the disaster got underway and it became clear that they were going to be charged with tens of billions of dollars in liabilities, it still hasn't been cleared how many tens of billions. It's a minimum of 20. It could be 50 or more, depending on whether they are found guilty of criminal negligence, not just civil negligence. But it's at least in the many billion, tens of billions of dollars. As that became known, there were secret efforts by ExxonMobil and Royal Dutch Shell, the number one and number two companies, to make an effort to gobble up BP at its weakest moment. ExxonMobil met with President Obama to talk about whether he would approve that or not. Apparently he did. Shell met with the British Prime Minister to discuss these plans. Eventually BP survived, but it only survived by selling off tens of billions of dollars of its assets at bargain basement prices to get extra cash to pay off the claims. And the business press talked about vultures surrounding the carcass of BP as it struggled to survive. It has survived, but as a much smaller company. This is the kind of behavior I'm talking about. And I could give you many other examples in the mining industry. I don't have to go into detail, but there is a predatory struggle underway in the mining industries of the big companies gobbling up all of the smaller ones to get hold of their reserves, of their assets, as the world's supply diminishes. In this battle, many of these companies are going to have the backing of state governments, because states view this struggle as crucial to the survival of the national economy. For example, a good example that I write about in a previous book called Rising Power, Shrinking Planet is the Sakhalin Island oil and gas project off of Russia. This is the biggest investment in Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and probably the biggest single foreign investment in Russia altogether ever. And the lead investor was Royal Dutch Shell for the Sakhalin II oil and gas project of Sakhalin Island. Well, in 2006, President Putin decided that he wanted that to be taken over by Gazprom, the state-controlled natural gas monopoly. And what did he do? He got his environmental organization. Any of you follow Russian affairs or Soviet affairs will know that this country does not have a great record of environmental protection. Suddenly, the Russian environmental organization discovered that Shell Oil had all of these environmental mistakes and violations, and so Putin shut down Royal Dutch Shell until finally they caved in and sold a majority stake in their Sakhalin property to Gazprom for half of what it was worth. And they had to write off $10 billion in investment, and now Gazprom owns majority stake in that project. That's what, just now, and so Putin now controls all of the major oil and gas projects in Russia today. That's one example. Other examples are how China goes about doing business in Africa or Latin America to ensure that the state-owned companies, CNOOC, the China National Offshore Oil Company, CNPC, China National Petroleum Corporation, and Sinopec have a piece of African oil ventures, or the Chinese state mining companies have a piece in African mining. These arrangements are not made by corporate officials, but by the president of the country, Hu Jintao, who will travel to African countries and offer all kinds of goodies to African presidents to sign up with the Chinese companies to sell a junior partnership in a big oil field. So, for example, in Sudan, and these goodies could include development grants and loans, or arms transfers, or protection at the UN, the way China has protected President of Bashir of Sudan from hostile UN sanctions and actions because of the human rights violations that have occurred there. Ditto in Zimbabwe. In Sudan, CNPC is the leading producer of oil. In Zimbabwe, Chinese companies own a lot of agricultural land and get a lot of their mineral products. So again, the state intervenes in order to favor the fortunes of state-owned companies. Do I have the right president for North Sudan? Is it Bashir, or am I mixing people up? Somebody correct me if I'm
Syria.
That's, yeah, I'm getting people mixed up, right? It's, who's the president of Sudan? Yeah, I have it right? Thank you. Correct me, people, if I have people wrong. And this leads then to the second order of approximation, or second level of this Darwinian struggle, as I see it. The race for what's left is a struggle among the major powers on the planet today, all of which understand, their leadership understands that for their society to flourish in the future, and their industries to flourish, for their economy to flourish, for their people to have enough food to eat in the future, for their electricity to turn on, and their highways, their transportation system to have enough fuel, they have to make sure that they have enough resources in the future, even if it means that other people do not. Hence, the procurement of resources is increasingly becoming a state matter, more and more. And this is not simply, basic minerals, basic materials, it's virtually everything. And this is going to become increasingly a matter of intense struggle, because it's not just maintaining our lifestyle, but now we're going to be on a planet in the next few decades of 9 billion people, a couple of billion more than we have now. And it's not population growth mostly that pushes politicians, that makes politicians anxious, but the fact that all these 9 billion people want to have a lifestyle like we in the United States and in Europe and in Canada largely enjoy. A car powered by oil in most cases, air conditioners, televisions, computers, private house or a nice apartment. I know not everybody in this room enjoys that, but that's the myth in China, in India, that everyone in this country has all these things. And now you have 1.5 billion Chinese and 1.5 billion Indians who kind of want to duplicate that for themselves. And let me tell you, there's not enough oil and cobalt and iron and aluminum and uranium and anything else on this planet to provide all that stuff for 3 billion middle-class Indians, Chinese, and 1 billion of us and Europeans and Canadians. There is not enough. There's not. Happy to discuss. Did somebody put the lights back on?
I must have done something.
I can't read my text.
That's
so I could probably
this is
do that if I
appropriate.
had to.
Your talk is very appropriate.
There's not enough light.
Just as you said it.
Thank you. Yes, just as I say yes. Didn't think of that. Thank you. I'm happy to go over these one by one, but basically there isn't enough of this stuff left. So leaders around the world are moving to ensure that there's enough. And I'll give you some examples that I write about in my book, The Race for What's Left. I write about the King Abdullah Initiative for Saudi Agricultural Investment Abroad. Sounds benign enough. Saudi Arabia, you know, is mostly desert, doesn't get a lot of rainfall, basically can't feed its population, which is one of the fastest growing population-wise countries in the world. No way of feeding its population in the future, and the king has decided that Saudi Arabia has to own farmland elsewhere to grow food for Saudi Arabia. So where did they go? Ethiopia. I don't think I have to tell you that Ethiopia is not exactly a country full of fully bellied people. In fact, a large number of people in Ethiopia are very malnourished or starving. However, Saudi Arabia has bought hundreds of thousands of acres, an area the size of Belgium, to grow food that is airlifted every day to Saudi Arabia and protected by fences and armed guards. This is what I mean. And Saudi Arabia is hardly alone. Other Persian Gulf countries have done the same. China and South Korea have done the same. Buying farmland in other countries, these are called land grabs, to grow food to ensure that their population will eat, even if the people in Africa starve to death. Tough luck. That's one example. Another is the Russian drive to develop the Arctic. You may recall that 4 or 5 years ago, a Russian mini-sub planted a titanium Russian flag on the North Pole, at the bottom of underneath the ice, at the bottom of the North Pole. This was supposedly viewed as some kind of a gimmick. It wasn't a gimmick at all. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, if you can prove that your continental shelf extends out however far, you can claim that undersea area as part of your exclusive development zone and have exclusive right to develop it. And what Russia has done is claimed about 40%, no more, something like 60% of the Arctic Ocean as its national territory for its exclusive development. And Russia has said, President Putin has said, the Arctic is going to be our future strategic resource for the future development of Russia. We're going to develop it. It houses something like 35% of the world's remaining natural gas and 15 or 20% of the world's remaining oil. This is what he sees as to keep the Russian economy going, is to exploit that. What about the threat to the wildlife that lives there? Well, forget about them. And the people who live up there are indigenous peoples in Russia. You may not know that, but they're there too. Their life is at risk. Another example. The fight over the East China Sea and the South China Sea that's been in the news. Over these little specks of islands you've been hearing about. And it's being presented as, those crazy Asians, they get all worked up over this silly little nonsense, nationalism and World War II. That's not what it's about. What it's about is whoever claims those islands can claim a 200-mile EEZ, exclusive economic zone, surrounding them. And in that 200-mile EEZ are rich oil and natural gas reserves that those countries want to develop. So they want to control them, and neither China nor Japan is willing to give up control over that oil and gas because they want it to be developed by their national oil companies. Well, I'll give you another example that you may not have thought of, and we can come back to this. The 2012 American presidential election. I know it's about a variety of things, but for the Republicans, this is primarily an election about energy. What is going to be the energy paradigm for the United States? The biggest contributors to the Republican Party are energy interests, and their intention is to win the election, to buy the election through advertising as much as they possibly can. They're the biggest contributors to the campaign. We're not in a swing state, so we're not exposed to this. We'll go to the swing states, and you can't turn on a TV without hearing advertising from the energy industry about how President Obama is holding back the development of our energy reserves and not producing jobs. And you heard that in the debate, and you're going to hear it a lot more from Mr. Romney about how he wants to create jobs and energy independence. And he says, you know, we have all this energy here. All we have to do is eliminate every environmental law ever passed in this country, turn over our farmland to the frackers so they could plunder it, poison our water, poison the air, turn this into a third world country, what we used to call a third world country. You know, those were when the third world was the third world, and American companies could come in there and pollute the shit out of the place and, you know, fuck the local people without any repercussions. That's, I'm talking their language, not my language. That's the way they would talk.
Okay.
Amongst themselves, you know, in a closed room with a bottle of scotch and a cigar. They would go into Nigeria and Venezuela and Colombia and, you know, extract everything, poison the water supply, and so on. But you can't do that in Venezuela anymore, and a lot of other places. Third world ain't what it used to be. What country is left for exploitation? Only the United States. So we have to be turned into a third world country to extract what's left. Now it isn't easy because it's embedded, what's left is embedded in rock, solid rock. The only way you can get it is to frack the hell out of it, smash it with water. And the result of that is going to be to, you know, and it's farmland. It's in Pennsylvania, New York State, West Virginia, Maryland, Ohio, in working farms. So those poor people have to be shoved aside, their land destroyed, and their water supplies poisoned in order to do this. But, you know, we're just another third world country to be polluted because, after all, the third world ain't what it used to be anyway. That's what this election is about. Anybody feels differently, I will give them an opportunity to challenge me on any of this. So, that's the consequences of the race for what's left. And there's a, you know, what will be the end of all of this? The end of all of this will be a hollowed out planet. A planet of holes, you know, giant strip-mined places with nothing in them. Like the mountaintop removal. Some of you may have heard this expression. That's how you can get coal in this country, because most of the coal is gone that was easily accessible. The way they get it now is to dynamite the top of mountains, shove the top into the valleys below, destroy the water supply for West Virginia and Kentucky, and then strip mine what's left. So what we're going to have in another 20, 30, 40, 50 years is a planet of holes, poisonous water, a devastated landscape, unbreathable air. That's what's left. And I don't think the human species will be able to survive very well under those circumstances. Now, I don't think it's going to come, we're going to get all the way there. At some point, people will respond in various ways. There will be an attempt to survive, to adapt, to cope with these looming disasters, and you can see plenty of signs of that. So I conclude my book with a discussion of what I call the race to adapt. There will be efforts by various communities, cities, states, nations, peoples, tribes, to adapt as best they can to a sickening planet. And this will be competitive too. It's not, I'm sorry, I'm not one of those people who thinks that we're all going to get together at the United Nations and do this simultaneously. I don't think it's going to work that way. I wish it would. I think more likely some people are going to say, the hell with this. Let's be among the leaders to adopt the new technologies, to make our community all green, to preserve our farmlands, to preserve our water supply, to rely on renewable energy exclusively, to rebuild using totally recycled materials or artificial materials or whatever, so we're not dependent on non-renewable materials. And you can see signs of that. You go to Germany and you can see a renaissance of energy, of building materials, buildings being completely rebuilt from the inside out to make them need no heating or energy, to vastly diminished energy requirements, solar panel on every house, and the like. And there are cities in China that are moving in that direction. Cities in Denmark moving, and islands in Denmark moving in that direction. These people will be the victors in a struggle to master the new survival technologies for prospering, for flourishing on a hollowed out, hotter, polluted planet of the future. And those that master these new technologies will prosper and flourish. So I don't foresee a planet in which all are losers. There will be winners and losers. And my message is that everyone who's smart has to choose whether they want to be a winner or a loser in this contest. That's what this election is about, although I don't think Mr. Obama is doing a very good job of selling the alternative. He did in the first time around. He sort of has abandoned that. But there are plenty of people in this country, in Silicon Valley, California, in the Pacific Northwest, here in Massachusetts, who are providing guidelines, blueprints for what a sane, in terms of resource consumption, what a sane future is for survival and prosperity on a different planet. But there are plenty of people who don't want us to go down that path, who want us to continue on an obsolete, dangerous paradigm of reliance on fossil fuels, non-renewable materials, and so on. And they're going to do everything in their power to ensure that we're forced to swallow that. That's what politics in this country has become. So I want you to think about all that I've said. I hope that I have stimulated thinking about all of this, and I've pushed my ideas as far as I could in the hope of getting some discussion going. And I look forward to your comments, reactions, responses, whatever. But thank you very much for giving me a chance to lay out this argument. Thank you. My attention first.
Thank you, Michael Klare. I always enjoy listening to what I don't say.
You have to speak louder.
Thank you. I always enjoy. Maybe it's the wrong word. Enjoy listening to you, but I come anyways. I've read your books. This is even more complicated. I would like you to address the issue of because there are writers and thinkers who are taking this even further, and they're talking about population crash and a desperate struggle over just really basic survival on this planet. James Howard Kunstler, for instance, who I also read. Can you address that? Because it isn't simply, none of this is simple, obviously, but the new technology people who are at MIT and Silicon Valley and so forth, who are trying to come up with all these, Kunstler calls this gimmickry. These thinkers are saying that there is no way to maintain current levels of anything on this planet, and that what we're facing, and nobody wants to even think about it, is probably a $3, $4, $5 billion population crash, and a very different way of life, all of us. Could you address that, please?
Yes, I have a different perspective than that. And it's partly because I follow closely what the industries are doing. And they are deploying extraordinary technology to squeeze out of the earth a bit more. So we are not seeing the rapid decline that even I and others have predicted. What we're seeing is a race for what's left, and the extraction of resources that previously were inaccessible. So now the other side of the equation of this argument, on one side there's James Kunstler, that this is gimmickry and it's not going to do anything. On the other side of the equation are the people I debate who say that there'll constantly be new technology that will solve the mess. That in another 50 years the Arctic will be a tropical paradise because of global warming. Isn't that wonderful? And we'll be able to extract infinite supplies of everything we need from the Arctic. Of course, the tropics will be uninhabitable, but we'll figure out ways to move those people in a kind, gently way. We'll move them all from the tropics. All of Mexico will be moved in some. That technology will find a solution. I think that's utter nonsense. I think we are reaching the limits of what technology can do. You can drill in 2 miles of water now, but I'm really doubtful that you could go to 5 miles of water and whatever. So, the technology will keep this going a while longer. But more expensive, it will be more expensive. And so what's going to happen is a systemic impoverishment of everybody. Some people will get a little richer, and we'll just constantly, our standard of living will be eroded. But I don't think we'll see the population crash. But I think, what I would predict is that you'll have a general decline in lifestyle for most people on the planet, but with enclaves of the super rich. Does that sound like what's happening now? Yes, it does. And so it'll be more like the late Middle Ages, where you did indeed have centers of wealth and civilization surrounded by peasantry.
Lovely.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not even right, because your question is important when I'm taking time on it. I do think that places like Scandinavia, the Pacific Northwest, Japan, South Korea, maybe parts of China will figure this out and will find ways to provide their citizens with the means of survival. But vast numbers of people will live a very diminished quality of life. Please, and then you.
I spend a lot of time in Denmark, and one of the things, and Scandinavia, one of the things that's interesting there is the ideology of simplicity and the way in which that has encouraged citizens to accept that living a simpler life is not necessarily a sign that you failed.
Yeah.
They do seem to, I mean, it's very interesting because the very rich there often ride their bikes in the rain to work. They might have a Mercedes-Benz in the garage, and there are big differences between rich and poor, but at the level of the way people operate on a daily basis, there is a whole ideology of being self-sufficient, tough, using less resources and public transport. And so it seems to me we also have to talk about not just economics, but also why do certain places develop this kind of a set of ideas and others where that was more common in the U.S. a long time ago, and we have lost it.
Yeah, we've lost it. I truly think that there are places like that, and there will be here too. In San Francisco Bay Area, there's a lot of that way of life, and I'm sure in other college towns. But I talk to my son who's 24 and his friends and my students who are undergraduates and recent graduates, and none of them have any expectation of living in a McMansion or owning their own house, which is different from my students 20 years ago. And they talk about sharing an apartment in Brooklyn, 5 people in a space half the size of this room at a rent that is beyond my, conception. And they see this is what life is going to bring to them. And they don't see this as an environment, a ethical choice or an aesthetic choice. They see this is the way it is. That's what the economy has brought them to. And they make various adjustments to it, and they're learning how to cope with that and make it work for them. But it's not out of a green environmentalist ideology. And I think that's what's going to happen, that people's expectations will be lower, they'll learn how to live with less and make the best of it and get on with their life, but it will be with much reduced expectations. You were next, and then I'll get you.
Yeah, I think the question of ideology is really important, and I have sort of a question about, I guess, connecting it bigger to sort of the oil lobbyist stranglehold on politics, and as a way that sort of forms this myth of prosperity and bounty, and this idea that we can continue to take all this oil, continue to run, fossil fuels in our SUVs all the time, versus this sort of practical, realistic idea of investing in public infrastructure, in increasing bicyclists in the area, and sort of that gulf between those two ideas, because it is practical and it is accessible for people. Like even in Boston, they just released a statistic that 0.7% of people bike to work, like 0.7, like less than 1%. And I bike to work all the time, and I just don't. I think about these issues a lot, and I read you on Tom Dispatch for a long time, and it just sort of, I can't figure out how we can sort of push that towards the other way, towards this sort of idea of, because I really think it's sort of the oil money that sort of saturates all of the Washington lobbyists that really push for this, and push for this Arctic drilling, and there's sort of that other conversation that never really makes it to the main stage.
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying. So you have to do both. You have to promote the attractiveness and the ethicality of the alternative. But I still think in the end, people are going to increasingly make that choice because they're gonna, put their finger up to the wind and see it's the sensible thing to do. It's gonna increasingly make sense to people. And so they will, and the more people who do that, more people will then become lobbyists for more bike lanes. So it will acquire momentum. That's what I think will happen. But the initial push is going to be the reality of what I'm talking about. I promise this person, and then I'll get you.
Sure. Just to kind of follow on that, I think it may be a generational thing. We're just going to have to pass a few more generations into the future where the younger generations are suffering into, by force of necessity, making some of these lifestyle changes. Because the older generations, such as my parents, they feel extremely upset at the threat to their entitlement to use as much of these resources as they like. That was the mentality that they were imprinted with, and it's the politicians that are screwing us up. How dare you tell me that we can't extract the oil to make gas for our cars, that kind of thing. Which is one other thing. And I think it probably will happen because as you say, the sort of the balance of sentiment is going to change when you get a critical mass of people, 20, 30 years in the future when
It'll be sooner than that, because conditions will deteriorate sooner than that. But I worry about something else, about when you talk about entitlement. In this country, the people who have that sense of entitlement are an older generation that you're talking about. In China and India, it's a younger generation who feel that they're entitled to have a car and in an air-conditioned house or an apartment. And they really feel that they're entitled to that. And they want it very badly. And, you know, it's a very powerful drive that they have. And they want their leaders to provide that. And that's going to be a very real problem, because I don't see how their expectations can be satisfied while we retain, you know, even a glimmer of what we have now. And I deeply worry that this will lead inevitably to a clash between the U.S. and China over African oil or Middle Eastern oil or something. This is my big worry, that this will lead to U.S.-China friction over a diminishing supply of oil to keep these things going. Because the way things are going now, the U.S. now imports twice as much oil as China. But that's changing very rapidly. In another 10 or 15 years, China will need to import more oil than we do. And there's only going to be a few places you can go to: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Angola, Nigeria, and the places, Venezuela, places we go to. And that's going to be, in my mind, that's the most dangerous geopolitical reality. I could go on about that. So the entitlement of Chinese and Indian rising middle classes is as great a danger as anything else. And we have to think about, how can we communicate? I think this is a responsibility we have. How can we communicate to them somehow that copying our mythic American, which some of people do have, but it's mythic in some sense. They see American TV. They think everybody lives in Los Angeles and has a big house with 2 cars. Truly, my students tell me this from China. I mean, my Chinese students tell me this. They see these and they think that that's what the ordinary American has, and they want to duplicate that. And we have to somehow communicate that's a myth, and it's dangerous to try to copy it. I promise you, and then you.
Well, I think you've got the relationship reversed between the people on the street and what they want, and the people in the driver's seat who actually determine what they're allowed to even talk about.
It may be
And
so.
I want to give one great example.
Yeah.
The beginning of Obama in 2009, there was the Copenhagen summit. All these people were so excited about a president that talked about the environment, that cared about the people, that was quote-unquote anti-war. He goes to Copenhagen and nothing gets accomplished because he represents a system, essentially, of capitalists and their interests in the world. And they were interested in global conquest and plunder. And that's what's continued in the last few years under Obama. All the people wanted to do something different in Copenhagen. People were incredibly disappointed with Obama in Copenhagen, but he couldn't do nothing, and he will do nothing. And he's going to pass the Keystone XL pipeline, even though he paid lip service to. So I think it's a system. We need a systemic change. Now, the views of the people are very much determined by who is in control in the system that tells you what you're supposed to desire, what you're supposed to seek and aspire to. But there's a battle among the people, and I think it's more a question of the future, hoping for, we need a clash between haves and have-nots, not between one group of capitalists here and one group in China that's also pursuing this predatory agenda. We need a different kind of scenario. I think you ought to consider that prospect, and the need for a systemic change is at the foundation of it. Capitalism can't do the things we want it to do.
I totally agree with you that we need a systemic change. And I think that capitalism as it's now formed, which is internally divided, as you say, is a very large part of it. But I also think that there's a problem that we have, humans, that is to say, have become accustomed to a growth model that we have an expectation that we're always going to have more. And that's true not only of, that's true of all of the industrial revolutionism, socialism and communism and capitalism. All have created this notion that we can provide more and more people with more. We have to eliminate that mode of thinking as well. So both things have to go hand in hand, but I appreciate your comment. Yes?
I came in a little late. What percentage of energy resources does the United States use?
Of the world's?
Yeah.
Something between 22, 23%.
Okay, so we're 6% of the world's people.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not exactly sure that the rest of the world is going to be that sympathetic when 6% of the world's people who are using 23% of the energy turn and say, we all need to, you know,
Yeah. But
to
China
adjust.
now, but China has overtaken us to be number
on
one.
the percentage?
Yeah, total percent of world energy, they're higher than us.
And
So
what percentage of the population?
I think that, you know, our share has gone down. It may be 20% and maybe
Okay.
maybe 22% or something. The numbers keep
And
changing.
what percentage of population-wise? I'm just thinking about like what the rest of the world, the majority of the world is, you know, is gonna want to play along with, you know, such disproportionate history in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. They resent us, but also admire this mythic way of life that we enjoy and they want to duplicate it.
But we say that the rules are different now. We can't play the
Well,
game the same way. You can't
that's
have what we have.
That's exactly what people in China say. How can you come and tell us that we can't enjoy what you have? You have no right to do that. And so when our leaders come and say you're increasing your carbon dioxide emissions too much, you've got to stop doing that. They say, you know, who are you to tell us to do that? We have every right to do what you did. And that's exactly what happens. Yes, there is this resentment, but it's more complicated because, I mean, what the Arab Spring Revolt is all about is that the U.S. and the Europeans have historically allied themselves with local dictators, local petro regimes or whatever, and hid behind them and kept the population down by favoring these local dictators, Mubarak in Egypt, the Saudi royal family, and a lot of the anger that might have been directed towards the West gets directed towards the dictators who oppress them locally. And Arab Spring saw a shift in that, and that situation has become much more unstable as a result. Yes, well, somebody who hasn't answered the question. Yes, please.
You describe you describe solutions occurring in a largely localized context.
Initially.
Do you have any confidence in international, for example, the Millennium Goals of the UN or any of those programs and being fruitful and helping to address some of these?
There, at certain places, certain times, but I don't have confidence in the United Nations as such, not because I don't think there are good people there, well-intended people, but the corruption of this system is too great to overcome that. What I was just saying, how the extractive industries form these corrupt relationships, whether from the United States or Europe or China or India, form these corrupt relations with local elites and local military juntas and the like. So it's very hard to make progress in that circumstance. Yes?
Lester Brown in his book argues that even if we all do what the UNFCCC tells us to do and we follow the plan of, you know, environmentalists and all those things, nothing will change, that the damage is done and the impacts of climate change and resource depletion will be felt up to 70 years to come. Are you as pessimistic, or do you feel that definitely if we did change, we definitely reverse
You know, the planet is going to become much less pleasant place to live on. Humans will be able to survive in that environment. It will be more difficult, and some people will be more privileged in how they respond, how they survive than other people. That will be largely a factor of geography and climate. I think if you live in Scandinavia or New England or the Pacific Northwest, you have a better chance of doing well in the future because you have water. You'll probably have water and a climate that's bearable. If you live in the tropics or on the edge of the Sahara Desert or in Central America, in Central Asia, your chances are going to be much worse. Not because you're any different than anybody, you're just in the wrong place. So
So
it's
even if we obeyed the rules of environmentalists, definitely.
yeah,
there's,
you're just in the the way things are going. There's nothing that can be done. Those areas are going to be more heavily affected than other areas, in all likelihood. In all
You can always
likelihood.
make things worse.
What's that?
You can always make things worse.
Yeah.
My argument is why do we make such an effort if we really can't change anything?
Because
Because
it could,
it-
because the difference between much worse and catastrophically worse is very big.
Actually, it's more like the difference.
For example, there are about 1 billion people who live in cities within 10 feet of sea level. 1 billion or more. Many of those, Boston is one of them. New York City is another. Miami, but many in the developing world as well. If the worst comes to pass, those cities will become uninhabitable. But that's not predestined that will happen. So preventing that is, in my mind, is worth preventing. However, the deserts are going to become bigger. The deserts will spread. So the Sahel in Africa will expand, and parts of Central America and the American Southwest will become uninhabitable, no matter what. So there will be things that cannot be stopped. So humans will continue to survive, but some people will be better off than others. And here's the point I was trying to make earlier: those who start earliest to make preparations and to adapt will be better off than those who wait too late. You have an answer.
Let me take a contrarian point of view.
Please.
Why can't we rely on market dynamics to in fact prevent the kind of scenario?
Oh, that's
they
easy.
suggest? Let me just finish this. There are already shifts in patterns going on, major shifts. For example, for the last year or so, or 2 years, there's been a significant reversal in the United States as urban areas are now once again growing in population and rural areas, and the exurbs are in fact declining. Everyone knows that urban areas are much more environmentally sustainable than the kind of sprawl. The other thing is, as the price of oil continues to increase, as you say, what makes us think that places like China won't turn to vast reliance on things like nuclear energy? Even the Japanese, who had this horrible situation in Fukuyama, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, will not do away with nuclear power. They know they can't do it at this point. I'm not a nuclear advocate, but I'm suggesting that are we not downplaying too much the kind of dynamics that occur because the market sends out signals, or however you want to provide incentives?
Happy to answer that. First of all, nuclear power nowhere in the world is sustained by market forces. Not one place on the entire planet is there a nuclear industry that operates without government subsidies. In Japan, it was totally financed by the government. In China, ditto. So nuclear power cannot exist without government subsidy. So forget that.
Well, why do you say forget it? There's nothing necessarily wrong with government subsidizing.
That's not a market force.
Okay, but
A market, so let me just start with, I'm just throwing that into the document there. Secondly, and this is a bit of a response to what this other gentleman was saying, is there are market signals that should be saying, as I write about, it's time to create a new capitalist system that can survive for the long haul. The problem is that the most powerful corporations ever created are the oil and extractive industries. And they have a business plan that calls for continued extraction and production of fossil fuels. And they have no intention of switching. They would rather fight to preserve their way of life, their business, their profits. And the way they seek to do that is to buy the American presidency. And more importantly, which is not being reported, state legislatures, one by one. And to maintain that. Now, eventually, that system will collapse. You know, by then it may be for anybody to live an agreeable lifestyle, but they will fight as long as they can, and it's atavistic behavior. Markets do not have a brain; they behave atavistically, and it happens that the most atavistic corporations are the most powerful, and they are determined to prevent the adaptation that's necessary. Now, there are places where they are being challenged. In California, in Denmark, in Germany. So, you know, over time, I think the forces of change will gain momentum. But meanwhile, the forces of retrograde politics, I think, will hold out and prevent the necessary change. Yes, I promise. And I'll
Part for energy. I would have expected that you were going to talk about the battle places in Africa and South America. That's first world corporations made those places.
They've been thrown out of those places. Yes, to some degree.
So you think those places are safe from that stuff?
Not really. I mean, Africa is not. But it's China that is the principal investor now in Africa, and increasingly in Latin America, in Brazil, in Chile, in Peru. China is the leading investor in the extractive industries, and Venezuela in oil. So, and elsewhere, we see more and more of China. The reason why this is so is because the energy companies, they want to own assets. And they can only do that in countries that have Anglo-Saxon law, which is US, Canada, Norway, Britain, and that's the Arctic. So they want to go to those places. That's a complicated discussion, but that's why they're there. They don't want to go to Venezuela. Chinese companies will go to Venezuela. I think people are leaving. I recognize you. Why don't we make that the last question?
Yes, I want to address his point about market forces. Markets by nature do not lead, they follow. There has to be sufficient demand for something before there's even a sustainable way for someone to meet that through the market. I mean, if nobody's interested in buying solar panels, nobody's going to make solar panels.
Well, can I just say something? That seems to be contradicted by the experiences that we have. Again, the increasing urbanization, which is due to the fact that it's very expensive to live out in big reserves. Renewed interest in mass transit and high-speed rail, the decline of airline use in terms of short-run transportation, all being brought about because the costs are just not sustainable. It's not because people have said, we don't want to fly from Boston to New York anymore. It's just too costly. So I don't believe that what you're saying is entirely accurate.
I think we could have a long discussion about that, but I think we should end this formal discussion. I'm happy to talk with people individually. I have some copies of my book to sell and sign if anybody's interested. They're $25, cheaper than in the bookstore, but a little more expensive than at Amazon, I guess, so I can lower the price. Anyway, thank you very much.